لقد جاءكم رسول من أنفسكم عزيز عليه ما عنتم حريص عليكم بالمؤمنين رؤوف رحيم.
All right. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We're in week 2 of Ramadan, and alhamdulillah, this is a very special, different Ramadan. It's taken some things away from us, some of the community things. This coronavirus, it's taken some of the togetherness, physical togetherness of the community aspect. But alhamdulillah, it's kind of created this alternative togetherness of where we can be more connected through things like Zoom and all these different modalities. And that's from the ni'mah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and from his blessings that he's given us this. And vis-a-vis this, we're using this opportunity to say a few words about the Prophet Muhammad in the next couple Sundays of Ramadan. The last Sunday, we spoke a little bit about his description. We wanted to talk about Seerah, and one important part of Seerah is actually descriptions of the Prophet, not just physical descriptions, but descriptions of him in previous scriptures. And that's what we did last week. And this week, what we want to do is descriptions of him from his own companions. And one of the best books to do that is the Shama'il of Imam al-Tirmidhi. And Imam al-Tirmidhi was a well-known hadith scholar. Of course, he has one of the 6 books of hadith for Sunni Muslims, the Sunan of Tirmidhi. He was born in this kind of, what's kind of like the border of Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, a couple hundred years after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and was very well known and renowned for his knowledge in hadith. And he wanted people to have something of the memory of the Prophet ﷺ. When you love someone, you cherish your memories with them, right? And your memories are so important. You hold on to them really, really tight. And one of the things that we find about the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is that people held on to those memories really, really tight, right? Not just what he said, which we know forms his sunnah, not just what he did, which we know forms his sunnah, not just the things that happened in front of him and he approved of, which forms his sunnah, but also something else that doesn't quite form the sunnah, right? But it's still a part of who he was, and it's thus a part of the seerah, and very important for us to know, which is his physical characteristics, right? And Imam Tirmidhi wanted to compile that, and he compiled more than that, not just his physical characteristics, but the specific characteristics that were specific to him, vis-a-vis how he dressed, vis-a-vis how he walked, vis-a-vis how he combed his hair, right? How he ate, all the little subtle things that you don't think about a person when you're describing them. He compiled in this book the Shama'il of the Shama'il Muhammadiyah. Shama'il are characteristics, right? And Shama'il Muhammadiyah are characteristics of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So this is a book that's gained well-known notoriety amongst Muslim scholars, especially people who are concerned with studying the seerah, because so much of the seerah has these nuances where if you know these certain aspects about the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, much of the seerah becomes better understood to you. And so there's a few reasons why you'd want to study a book like this. One, you love the Prophet. And if you love someone, you want to know them, right? You want to know everything about them. You want to know everything about what they said, but also what they look like. You want to know how they walked. You want to know how they dressed. You want to know the nuances of the ring that they wore, right? Or the shade of red that was in their dress. Like you want to know all these things if you truly love someone, right? And knowledge of these things does bring love. for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So either you're someone who's looking for knowledge of him and ends up loving him, or you're someone who loves him, right? And you want more knowledge about him, and it does that as well. The other thing about this book that's so amazing is it's a testimony to the truth and it verifies, right? It's a verification and affirmation of the messengership and the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why? Because no human being on the face of this earth has been described to the detail. I mean, the absolute detail. I mean, we're talking details of how water would flow off of his foot. We're talking about counting the actual number of gray hairs in his beard. I mean, we're talking about details that you wouldn't even imagine thinking about if you were to do your best in describing someone else. You know, someone is voted as like the most beautiful person in the world, like Miss Universe, right? Or something like that. People don't go off describing that person, right? They just label them, right? The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, people described him to the nth degree. Why? Because they were so mesmerized by him. No other human being has been recorded in history like this, right? And so that's why people like Michael Hart, historians like Michael Hart, would put him, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as the most influential person ever to walk on the face of this earth. And people, you know, Michael Hart wasn't even a Muslim. So the fact that, you know, as Muslims, when we read a book like this and we see how much care, inaya, like how much, you know, how careful they were to describe details about this man, that tells you how much shock and awe they were of his character, right? How mesmerized they were of his humanity, how just utterly kind of like humbled they were, right, with his charisma, and they wanted to get it all. They wanted to get it all, right? So that's the point of this book. This book has over 400 ahadith narrated in it. Sheikh Albani took out, you know, Sheikh Albani did a mukhtasar of this book, and he took out about 50 or so hadith and felt the rest were absolutely authentic. You know, it doesn't mean that the others aren't authentic. And we're not really, this isn't a book that's deciphering hudud laws or something like that. So if something goes from, you know, sahih to hasan, you know, that's okay. You know, that's okay. You know, this is Imam Tirmidhi, Sahib Ahad al-Kutub al-Sunan al-Sitta. You know, he's the one of the owners of the 6 books of Sunnah, essentially the 6, you know, outside the Quran, major sources of Sharia for Sunni Muslims. So that's okay. You know, and it's divided into several chapters. And in these chapters, you know, they go from describing his physical characteristics and hair, and khatam, the seal of his prophethood, to the way that he spoke, to the way that he laughed, to the way that he drank out of a cup, to his names, to the people who were of his family, to his humility, the type of rug that he slept on, you know. And the very last chapter is actually about seeing the prophet in the dream. And it's interesting, you know, some scholars might comment that the reason that he organized this book like this is that, you know, seeing the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his character, right, and then adapting that in your character, right, is perhaps a way to see him in your dream, right? That may be one thing. Allahu alam why Imam al-Tirmidhi organized it this way, but inshallah our goal is to have, you know, 2 main goals. One, we want to get through a good majority of the book for this Ramadan, and I'm gonna bypass a few ahadith, the ones that I feel like are somewhat repetitive. Like if you miss this hadith, you haven't missed anything, because the other ahadith include that. And a lot of the ahadith are repetitive, with the kind of just like, you know, one or two word, or, just kind of one or two sentence difference. So some of those I'm going to omit. The other goal is, and this is the most important goal, I want you to think about this dua that the Prophet Muhammad made. Every time that he would look in the mirror, he would say, Allahumma kama hassanta khalqi fahassin khuluqi, right? He would look in the mirror, and every time he would look in the mirror, he would say, oh Allah, as you have perfected my physical complexion, right, which is his khalq, which is the outer physical complexion, which is what this book is all about, right? As you've perfected my outer physical complexion, so perfect my inner character as well, which is khuluq. The two words sound very, very similar in the Arabic language, right? Khalq and khuluq, right? And the thing that we really want to look for, one of the things that we really want to look for, is the relationship between the two for the Prophet Muhammad. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create his eyes like he did? Why did he create his skin color like he did? Why did he create, his length like he did, and the thickness of the palms of Rasulullah like he did? And why did he create his eyelashes like he did? Those are some of the things that some scholars have actually looked at, and they've said, there's a wisdom and why the Prophet was created in this way, and why he was created that, because it's reflective of this part of his mission, right? And that's reflective of that part of his mission, right? And so when you want to study the mission of Rasulullah, when you want to study his seerah, it then becomes important to study these things as well, because sometimes the ayat kawniyah are isharat to the ayat, right, ruhaniyah. Sometimes the signs, the physical creation signs, are indicators to internal realities as well, right? And so sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will create, and he points us to that in the Quran. For example, Allah all the time in the Quran talks about, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all the time in the Quran talks about how he makes rain come down from the sky and revive a dead earth, right? Now that's a sign of creation. That's something that Allah created, right? But that metaphor comes in the Quran over and over again to tell us about a greater inner reality, which is how the verses of the Quran and the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is kind of like rain, right? How that revives a dead heart, which is kind of like a dead land, right? And how that dead land kind of comes back to life with all kinds of greenery. The heart comes back to life with all kinds of happiness and good deeds, which is a sign of life of the heart. So, that's the way in which the creation, right, the outer creation is a sign of the inner reality, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may have done that with the Prophet Muhammad. He may have made certain aspects of his outer creation reflective, right? Tashbihat, right? Almost like metaphors of certain realities of his inner character as well. So we're going to look for that as well, right? So we're going to begin here at the beginning of the book. In the first chapter of the book of Shimal al-Muhammadiyya of Imam al-Tirmidhi rahimahullah is Bab ma ja'a fi khalq, ma ja'a fi khuluq. Bab ma ja'a fi khalqi Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So this is the chapter in what has come to us in regards to just this outer complexion of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And there's about, I would say there's about maybe 10 or so hadith that I want to narrate from this chapter. I think if we narrate these 10 hadith, we've gotten the whole picture, and everything else is kind of repetitive between other companions or whatnot. So the first one's by Anas bin Malik, and Anas bin Malik was the servant of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We find that a lot of these hadith are narrated by younger companions, right? Because young people, they tend to look, right? They tend to look at you and make observations a little bit more carefully than older people do. They're kind of interested, right? Young people are curious. And so Anas bin Malik has a few hadith about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, about details that no one else has narrated. Someone else who's very, very important and critical in this book is Ali ibn Abi Talib, right? Because Ali ibn Abi Talib was the cousin of the Prophet, but someone much younger than him, and someone who lived with him in the house of Abu Talib, right? And someone who grew up with him and, grew up kind of like appreciative of his physical characteristics. And so Ali radiallahu anhu actually has the most potent of all physical descriptions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And of course, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam essentially said that he is the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate, right? So that's quite well in accordance with what we know about him. So Anas bin Malik narrates أنه سمعه يقول كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ليس بطويل البائن. Tawil al-Ba'in is someone who's excessively tall. The Prophet Muhammad was not excessively tall, right? وَلَا بِالْقَصِيرِ, and he wasn't too short, right? And so right off the bat, you look at the Prophet Muhammad, he was somewhere in between. His height wasn't too tall, it wasn't too short. رُبَعَةً مِنَ الْقَوْمِ, it says in other hadith, رَجُلٌ مَرْبُوعٌ, right? Someone who's kind of right in between. If you were to take 10 people, maybe, okay, he wouldn't be the tallest on one end, he wouldn't be the shortest on the other end, but he would be kind of somewhere in between. There are a lot of aspects about his creation that reflect this kind of like balanced, right? Not on this extreme, not on that extreme. Of course, why? What is that reflective of? That's reflective of the Prophet Muhammad being a balanced human being, right? Not being on one extreme or another extreme at any one point in his life. He was always in the middle. That is sawa'i sirat. Wahdina ila sawa'i sirat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to make this dua in the Quran. Guide us to the most middle portion of the path, right? So his khalq was reflective of this as well. So the first thing he talks about is his height. وَلَا بِالْأَبْيَدِ الْأَمْحَقِ. And then he talks about his skin color, right? He wasn't so white as to look pale. Amhaq is whiteness of like paleness, right? Wala bil adam, and he wasn't too dark in his complexion either, right? Again, why is that significant? One, he's not so pale, he's not so white to look pale, because paleness is actually a sign of sickness. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would never make the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam almost look like pasty or sick in his appearance, right? That wouldn't befit the appeal of like health that he comes for, which is comprehensive health, right? Hifz al-Siha is one of the maqasid of Sharia. Preserving health is one of the goals of the Sharia, and it's mental, physical, and spiritual health, right? But also look, his skin color is right in the middle as well. He's not ultra dark in his skin color. He's not ultra light in his skin color. But in other ahadith, azharul lawn, right? He's got this wheatish complexion, this brownish complexion, right? Other people talk about he's got, hues of redness in his complexion, right? Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And again, his appearance is an appearance of universality, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created his skin color to reflect that universal appearance of not being too much like this or too much like that, but something that kind of has a little bit of every hue in it, right? Every shade in it. And then he says, وَلَا بِالْجَعْدِ الْقَطَطِ. Ja'd al-qatat, ja'd is curly hair, and qatat is like excessive curly hair. So his hair wasn't too curly, okay? وَلَا بِالْسَبْت. Sabt is when you let your hair loose and it's just long and dangly, right? So it wasn't too curly, it wasn't too loose, right? So three things he describes right off the bat. He describes his height, he describes his skin color, and he describes the hair of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah sent him when he was 40 years old. So he stayed in Mecca for 10 years and he stayed in Medina for 10 years. That's what he says. Now we know he actually stayed in Medina for 13 years. And this isn't a lie, nor is it a mistake on the part of Anas bin Malik. This is simply a part of rounding out numbers and making the hadith sound nicer. Nowadays, you might consider that misinformation because we look at text in a very kind of like historicity and accuracy and all these, like the numbers have to be right. But back then, they were very comfortable rounding off numbers, and the culture of that time would deem that as accurate, which is another important lesson, right? Your truthfulness as a human being is very much related to the cultural perception of what truth is, right? If you're in a culture where getting a single digit off means that you've lied or something like that. Okay, then that's significant. But if you're in a culture where that's kind of seen as the norm, right? That's not seen as a mistake or communicating misinformation, right? So he's just making the hadith sound better by saying 10 and 10, right? And rounding numbers off. We know he was in Medina for 13 years. توفه الله على رأس 60 سنة وليس في رأسه. And Allah took his life right around 60 years of age. And then listen to this. This is amazing. ليس في رأسه ولحيته 20 شعرة بيضاء. He didn't have 20 gray hairs, not even 20 gray hairs in his hair and in his beard, right? Think about how carefully you have had to look at someone and how focused and just how perceptive you have to be of them and how magnetic they have to be to capture that perceptiveness on your part for you to know the number of gray hairs that's in their beard. How many people do you know where you've counted the gray hairs in their beard? Or you've even thought about doing that because you're like, this person is so amazing. I want to know how many gray hairs are in their beard, right? Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So that's the first hadith. The second hadith is again by Anas bin Malik radiallahu anhu. He says, Kana Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam rab'atan. He was sallallahu alayhi wa sallam rab'a. Rab'a is medium stature, right? Laysa bitawil wala bil qasir. He wasn't too tall, he wasn't too short. If there's a description that we've already talked about a little bit in detail, I'm just going to mention it and kind of move on. Hasan al-jism. His body was well proportioned. كان شعره ليس بجعد. His hair wasn't it wasn't too curled, right? ولا صبت, and it wasn't too straight. We talked about that. أسمر اللون. He had a brownish wheatish like complexion to his color, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. إذا مشى يتكفأ. Let's talk about that. That's very significant. When he would walk, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, when he would walk, he would يتكفأ. What does يتكفأ mean? يتكفأ means that you walk with purpose. It's almost like if someone were to watch you, right, or to observe you from a distance, you're like, man, that guy's going somewhere. They know where they're going, right? It's to walk with a purpose. It's to walk with a sense of motivation. Some scholars say it's as if you were walking down a hill. So that kind of like momentum, that's the word. It's to walk with momentum. That's so important because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his whole life had purpose, right? He lived his life with purpose to the extent that he always walked with purpose. He always knew where he was going. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, where are you going? What if you just asked yourself that question as a Muslim, right? Where am I going? Where am I going in life? Not just where am I going right now, right? Where am I going in life, right? And does it, right now, if someone were to watch me as I walk from A to B, right? Does it look like I'm lost? Does it look like I don't really know what I'm doing? Or does it look like I have motivation, I have purpose, I have drive, I have desire? And you can see that in my walk. You cannot associate with him, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, any degree of abath, any degree of randomness or senselessness or a lack of purpose, right? أَفَحَسِبْتُمْ أَنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ عَبَثًا. Allah says in the Quran, did you think that we created you without any purpose? Rasulullah said there wasn't a single point or a single aspect of his life that you would look at and feel like, what's the point of that? What's the point of that, right? None of that. There would never be that in his life, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The next hadith is by Bara ibn Azib, and it's the third hadith in this chapter. Bara ibn Azib is another one of those companions. He wasn't necessarily the youngest companion, but he was very curious about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so he had a lot of questions about his appearance. And so he would ask, and then he would inform, Kana Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam rajilan marbu'an. We have two possible readings here. You can say rajulan marbu'an, or you can say rajilan marbu'an. Actually, rajulan marbu'an is better. Rajilan would mean that he had medium statured hair. Rajil is hair, right? But rajul is a man. And so a medium statured man, again, we've already read that, and that probably makes more sense. بعيد بين المنكبين. This is narrated in different things, in different ways, and this is also another one of those things where the outer is reflective of the inner. He had ba'id, it was far between his two shoulders. Ba'id al-bayn al-mankabayn means it's far between his two shoulders. That means he was broad-chested. Think about that for a moment. What does it mean that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had a wide chest? What's in the chest? The heart, right? That's the locus that receives revelation. Rasulullah ﷺ had to have a wide chest to receive Quran over 23 years. And that Quran is not something narrow. That Quran is not something light. Inna sanulqi alayka qawlan thaqila. We are about to send upon you a heavy word, right? A heavy word. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He had to have a chest that was wide and expansive in order to be able to receive it. In fact, we know that sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he was a child around 8 years old, the angel Gabriel came to him when he was playing with another child in the desert, came to him, put him on the ground, split his chest open, right? Took his heart out, cleansed his heart, right? And took out the muqarrarul waswas, the place where shaitan would whisper in the heart, washed his heart, put it back in. And Anas bin Malik, in fact, another hadith says, I used to be able to see the sign of the heart being split, or the chest being split open, even as I was older, right? He could see the open heart surgery scar on the chest of Muhammad. So his chest was actually physically expanded as well, right? Ba'idan bayn al-mankabayn is very significant of that. It's also a sign of hilm, forbearance of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Adim al-jumma. Jumma is the hair that goes past your earlobes. Okay, when someone grows out their hair, and it comes past the earlobes, the jumma is in reference to that hair. Azim al-jumma means that hair on the Prophet Muhammad was thick and luscious, right? And he sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he let his hair grow out to that point, but not beyond his shoulders. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Alayhi hullatu hamra. The hulla is a two-piece garment, right? Kind of like an izar and the rida, and one would cover the upper part, the other would cover the lower part, the outside, okay? ظَاهِرُهُ مِثْلَ بَاطِنِهِ, right? The outside is like the inside of it. So it's almost like a reversible garment, right? That's what the hulla was. And he had a hulla that was humra. It was a reddish, right? Some of the scholars, they look at this hadith and say that there's permissibility in this hadith for wearing clothing that has a red kind of like color to it. He says, "Ma ra'aytu shay'an qad ahsana minhu." I never saw anything more beautiful than him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The next hadith is an Barra bin Azib قال ما رأيت من ذي لمة. I never saw someone who possessed limma. Limma is another word for the long hair that goes past the earlobe. في حلة حمراء, someone wearing a garment with reddish hues. أحسن من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. More beautiful than the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. له شعر يضرب منكبيه. He had hair that would come down to his shoulders. بعيد بين المنكبين. He was broad in his chest all the way out to both shoulders. لم يكن بالقصير ولا بالطويل. And he wasn't too short and he wasn't too tall. The next hadith is a long hadith by Ali ibn Abi Talib. We have the next two hadith about the descriptions of the Prophet Muhammad are pretty long descriptions. One is by the uncle, the maternal uncle of Hassan ibn Ali, the son of Ali, and the other is by Ali himself, right? And so Ali was extremely articulate in narrating characteristics of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so let's look at what he says. عن علي ibn Abi Talib رضي الله عنه قال لم يكن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بالطويل ولا بالقصير. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not too tall, nor was he too short. And he says شثن الكفين والقدمين. شثن is sturdiness and fleshiness, right? And he says radiallahu anhu that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had this sturdiness and fleshiness about the palms of his hands and about the soles of his feet. Now, why is that significant? Because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had to hold a sword in battle, right? And his feet had to be steadfast in battle. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created his hands and his feet such that He created them with strength, and he created them with the capacity to bear hardship, right? Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he would stand at night as well, right? And pray for hours and hours, and he had to have feet that would support that, but also he had to have feet that would support him in battle. So in the jihad against the nafs, in the jihad against the kafirun, Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was proportioned well in his palms of his hands and the palms of his feet. ضخم الرأس وضخم الكراديس. His head had a fullness to it, right? Such that it was in proportion to the rest of the body. You know that some people, you look at them and it seems like their head is just too small in regards to the rest of the body. Other people, you look at them, their head is too big, right, in regards to the rest of the body. But the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he had a head that was full, right? It was full all the way around, circumferentially all the way around. And so it would catch your eye, right? But that was in proportion to the rest of his body, because the next thing he says, dakhmat karadis. The karadis are the epiphyses of the bone, which is the end point. It's like your humerus, like the head of the humerus, or it's like the end point of the ulna, right, in the elbow joint, or it's like the end point of the radius here in the wrist or something like that. It's the points in the body, right, where the bone terminates. And those points in his body, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, had a fullness to it as well, right? And so he had this fullness to his body, which demanded respect, right? And his head was in proportion to that, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Tawilul masrubati, we haven't talked about that yet. The masruba is the hair that lines the belly button and goes all the way to the navel. So he had a long masruba, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. إذا مشى تكفأ تكفؤا كأنما ينحط من الصبب. It's another narration that he's giving here about sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When he would walk as if he was coming down a hill. We talked about that appearance of like having momentum in the way that he would walk, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. لم أرى قبله ولا بعده مثله. I never saw anyone before him or after him who was like him. And then he continues in another hadith, Ali radiallahu anhu, he says, لم يكن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. This is hadith number 7 in this chapter. بطويل الممغط. The mumaghat is تغطت قوسه يعني مده مدا طويلا. If someone تغطت his bow, it means that he kept elongating his bow more and more and more. So mughattat is to elongate something to the point almost that it becomes like lanky. Like, you ever seen someone who's like so tall that they're lanky, and it almost looks like that if you just blew on them they'd fall over or something, right? He says, Ali radiallahu anhu, لم يكن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بطويل الممغط, right? He wasn't so tall as to be like lanky, right? ولا بقصير المتردد, and he wasn't so short as to be mutaraddid. Mutaraddid is when it looks like parts of your body are too much into other parts. Like, it looks like the arm is like into the chest, and it looks like the hip is into the pelvis, and that makes you look too short. So he wasn't so short as to look like some parts of his body were into other parts, right? وكان ربعة من القوم, he was a medium stature in between people. لم يكن بالجعد القطط ولا بالسبت. We talked about that. His hair wasn't too curly, nor was it too straight. By the way, you've heard of that a lot now, because that is actually a very common description that was used in poetry to describe people and their facial characteristics. So it's not uncommon that a lot of companions have applied that to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because probably the listener at that time is waiting to hear, well, what about the hair? What about the hair, right? You know, كان جعدا رجلا, right? Some of his hair was curled, not too much though. ولم يكن بالمطهم. Mutahham, he wasn't mutahham. Mutahham is to be round out of obesity. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had no aspect of obesity. ولا بالمكلثم. Mukaltham is to have a rounded face because of obesity. You know, some people, they have a round face out of a natural, just kind of like proportion of how they are. But other people have like an acquired roundness to the face. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he had the natural roundness to the face, not an acquired roundness that comes from excessive lipid tissue that doesn't have anywhere to go, so it just kind of like hangs on the cheek or something like that. وَكَانَ فِي وَجْهِهِ تَدْوِيرٌ. He had a natural roundness, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, in his face. His roundness was like the roundness of the moon. It was a roundness that had a natural proportional beauty to it, right? It never looked like excessive tissue, right? Abyad musharrab. He had a light, white-like complexion that had hues of redness that would run through it. Again, we talked about another companion that said asmar al-lawn, wheatish. Those two colors seem different. And one thing that you think about here, Allahu alam, is it possible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because people have different color capacities in their eyes. Some people are colorblind. Some people see blue and green a little bit differently. Did people see his complexion just a little bit differently? And was that a part of the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make his appearance even more universal to mankind? Allahu alam. Is it that his skin color would change with the differences in temperature and differences of climate? And differences in exposure to sun, Allahu alam. That could also be a possibility. But then ad'ajul aynayn, this is interesting. Ad'aj is like extreme blackness, right? So his pupils had this extreme blackness to his aynayn, or eyes. And why is that important? Because what's around the pupil is the sclera, and that's very, very white. We have in other hadith that it was extremely white. Like around the black pupil was the whiteness of the eye, and that whiteness was very, very white. You ever seen someone who's like jaundiced, right? You see like that part of their eye actually becomes like yellow, and that's a sign that the bilirubin is too high, right? It's a sign of a person's health that the sclera keeps white and it stays white, right? And so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had a very, very white outer portion of the eye and a dark pupil, right? What does that allow for? That allows for contrast. Anytime you want to be able to anytime you want to be able to see something really well, you need really good contrast, right? And so that physical characteristic of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave him the ability to see sharply. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he used to make a dua, Allahumma arina al-ashya kama hi, oh Allah, show us things the way they really are. So Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he had this ability to see things the way they really are. Abdullah, I saw that you said that there was a question. If there is a question, just jump in, interrupt, and if you don't mind, just read the question, because I'm using the phone here and I can't, it's kind of hard to kind of switch it back between like chat and stuff like that. So
somebody texted me a question. Saying, I've heard that the Prophet ﷺ, having curly or wavy hair is not the sunnah because he would shave it at times. Is this true?
Well, what's better to say is that going out of your way to create curly hair, to make your hair curly, is not the sunnah, right? And we'll see in other ahadith, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam would let his hair be. That's what he would be with his hair. When he would take care of his hair, he says in another hadith, "Man yu'minu billahi wal yawmil akhir falyukrim sha'ra." Right? Whoever believes in Allah on the Day of Judgment, let him dignify his hair. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam would do that. He would dignify his hair, but he wouldn't go out of his way to make it too curly. If it looked like it was going to part to a side, he would let it part. Otherwise, he would let it go. Right? And no, he wasn't always shaved. He had hair that would come down just a little bit past his earlobes, right? And that was probably the majority of the time that his hair was like. Of course, when you go on Hajj, you shave your head. And so there were times when his head was shaved as well. He shaved his head after Hudaybiyah as well. And so sometimes, we'll see this in other hadiths, sometimes he would part it to the side. Sometimes he would let it naturally part in the middle. A lot of times his hair would come down past the earlobe. He had a natural slight curl, very, very slight curl, but it wasn't ja'd al-qatat, right? It wasn't too curled and it wasn't just too straight. Again, all of this is like, there's always Allah created everything about him in a certain balance. So yeah, just jump in, interrupt anytime and ask. So then he says, ahdab al-ashfar. The ashfar are eyelashes. So he had these long eyelashes. And we know the eyelashes are important for protecting the eyes, right? So sallallahu alayhi wasallam, his eyes are to see things the way they really are. That has to be protected. Sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Jaridul mushash wal katad. The mushash are again another word for like the endpoints of bones, and the katad is everything in between the shoulders. And he says, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that or it said about him, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that he had this fullness to the end point of his bones and everything in between the shoulders. Ajrad. Some parts of his body did not have hair. That's what that means. Du masrubati. And again, he had this this little bit of hair that kind of went from his chest to his navel area. Shafnul kafain wal qadamain. We talked about the fullness of his palms and the soles of his feet. إذا مشى تقلع كأنما ينحط من الصبب. When he walked, he would تقلع. This is a different word from takaffa'a, which is what we read before. And taqalla'a means, iqla'a means to literally strip something from the ground, right? And they described his walking like that because it was like every time he lifted his foot, it was as if his foot was like being stripped from the ground, right? It's like it had that much momentum to it and had that much like purpose to it. وَإِذَا الْتَفَتَ الْتَفَتَ مَعًا. Listen to this. This is beautiful. Whenever he would turn to address someone, he would turn and address them completely with his whole body. So if someone is here addressing me, he would turn like this and address that person with his entire body language, right? He would never just turn like this, right? He would never just do that, right? And so that was almost like not devoting 100% of his attention to someone, right? And it's less than rahmatan lil alameen, someone who's a mercy for all of the worlds, to be anything less than 100%, right? Devoted to whoever wants guidance from them at that one time. And that's also from the art of listening. You know, a lot of times nowadays, you know, always on our phones. We're on our phones even if someone is directly talking to us. You know, it's like we're what do they call that? Fubbing, you know, or, you know, it's like, you know, you're not really present. Your head is somewhere else. And if someone addresses you, you're like, yeah, hey, what's up? You know, like you're not really engaged in a conversation. We're listening, like we're hearing, but we're not really listening. And one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is As-Sami', the all hearing, right? And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, it was said about him in the Quran, وَيَقُولُونَ هُوَ أُذُنٌ. You know, they would ridicule him by calling him an ear, literally calling him an ear, because he was such a good listener, right? So much so they almost ridiculed him because of that. Like the Meccans ridiculed him because he would give so much of his time. It's said that one time a woman stopped him on the street and talked to him for an hour or 2 hours. And he just stood there and listened to everything that she said, right? And never ever parted his body from her to devote his full attention. So let's keep that as a, you know, just kind of like a character trait that we can all adopt, that when someone's speaking to us, let's devote our full attention to them, right? Let's not kind of like be doing 3 things at once. Got our phone here, got our our Apple Watch here, and we're doing this and we're doing that. We're like, hey, hold on a second. We're always saying, hold on 1 second. Like if you're saying, hold on 1 second multiple times a day, there's something wrong, you know? Like you got to be able to devote your attention to someone. Between the back of his shoulder blades was the seal of prophethood. We're going to talk about that more later. And he was the seal of the prophets. He had the most generous chest. He had the most honest tongue. He was the softest amongst them, right? And the most lenient amongst them in his natural disposition. And he was the most generous amongst them to kind of hang around with and be with. You know, someone might be like so spiritually, you know, engaged, and they might be really religious, but they may not be like social. They may not be fun being around. Someone else might be like, you know, fun being around, right? They may not be very honest. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, right? He had this honesty of tongue. He had this this kind of like leniency of natural disposition. He was also fun to be around, right? He was akramhum ishratan. He was fun. Sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he was enjoyable to be around. Being religious doesn't mean being a stone. It doesn't mean like having no emotions. It doesn't mean like being antisocial. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam he had a very important like ishrah to him. He had a very important like social life to him, and he would engage in the games of his companions. He would play with his wives, right? He would engage the curiosity of a 10-year-old kid about his bird or something like that. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He had a social component to his life. Man ra'ahu badihatan habahu. Whoever saw him for the first time was kind of like mesmerized by him. وَمَنْ خَالَتَهُ مَعْرِفَةً أَحَبَّهُ. But if you hung out with him enough and you mixed with him, you just ended up loving him, right? Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. يَقُولُ نَعِيتُهُ لَمْ أَرَى قَبْلَهُ وَلَا بَعْدَهُ مِثْلَهُ. Someone who's describing him would say about him, I've never seen anyone like him, not before him or after him. So that concludes the hadith by Ali radiallahu anhu. The next hadith is instigated by the son of Ali, Hassan ibn Ali. It says here, Hassan ibn Ali radiallahu anhuma قال سألت خالي هند ibn Abi Hala. He asked his maternal uncle Hind ibn Abi Hala وكان وصافا عن حلية رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. He was someone known to describe the Prophet Muhammad صلى الله عليه وسلم. وأنا أشتهي أن يصف لي منها شيئا أتعلق به. So Hassan tells his uncle, describe the Prophet for me. Like, I really want something to hold on to. Hassan ibn Ali must have been around, he was really young when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died, probably around 7 or 8 years old. And he didn't remember him after, how like when you lose someone after some time, you start to forget what they look like, right? And so now he's asking his uncle, give me something to hold on to so I can kind of remember what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, what he looked like, And so this is a beautiful hadith. And what you'll find is that Hind ibn Abi Hala, the way he describes the Prophet is he begins at the top and he goes all the way to the feet. And then from the feet to the way that he walked, right? And it all kind of like flows in a really beautiful way. He says, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فخما مفخما, right? First, he describes his overall persona, and then he goes to the head and goes to the feet. But fakhman, let's talk about that for a moment. Fakhman could mean fullness, but in this sense, it doesn't mean that. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had this sense of some bodiness. Here, this is what this means. Fakhman means this here. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had this sense of some bodiness, right? He wasn't self-loathing. He had self-esteem. There are a few ahadith in the beginning of the Seerah of Ibn Hisham, where he talks about how people would receive the Prophet Muhammad like his grandfather and his uncle, and even people who would come into Mecca and visit, and his mother, when he was very, very young, like a small child, how they would receive him. And one of the things that was common between what they would say is, Inna libni hada la sha'n. This son of mine, right? This son of mine has a sha'n. A sha'n is like a sense of somebody, like an importantness in their future. And Rasulullah ﷺ was raised with that feeling. This is so important because this is something that we should be transmitting to our children, right? We should give them a sense of self-esteem. We should give them a sense of somebodyness, a sense of importance, that they're going to be someone really, really important. How often is it that parents will oftentimes just criticize their kids and compare them to their siblings, right? And say, well, why aren't you more like your cousin so-and-so? Why aren't you more like your brother so-and-so? Why aren't you more like your sister so-and-so? And all that does is it just destroys the self-esteem of the kid, right? And they never really grow up with a sense of somebodyness. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he grew up with this sense of fakham, right? Self-esteem, fullness of esteem. That's what that means. Fullness of esteem, fullness of self-esteem, self-respect. That's really important to have, as not arrogance, right? There's a difference between arrogance, which the Prophet Muhammad says is to look down on people or to be stubborn against the truth, right? Batarul haq wa ghamtun nas. You look down on people or you're stubborn against it. That's what arrogance is. But a sense of some subtle confidence and somebodyness, that's not arrogance. And he had that sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so he was fakhman, but also mufakhaman. He would give other people that impression of him as well, right? So Aisha radiallahu anha, she says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was always smiling, right? But also always making other people smile, right? He was always smiling, but always making other people smile as well, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in this sense, he had this self of this esteem of fullness, right? But when other people saw him, they would gain the same perception, which is another important psychological truth here. How you see yourself is how other people will see you as well. 100%. Mark this down as truth. How you see yourself is exactly how your coworkers are seeing you. It's exactly how your friends are seeing you. It's exactly how the person who walks by the street sees you as well, right? It's how your family members see you. If you see yourself as self-loathing, if you see yourself as worthless, that's how other people see you. If you see yourself as significant and as someone having a sense of somebodyness, other people see that about you as well. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فخما مفخما يتلألأ وجهه تلألأ القمر ليلة البدر. His face would sparkle and it would glitter, and it had glamour in it the same way a full moon has a glitter and a glamour in it on its full moon night. أطول من المربوع. He was slightly taller than a medium stature person. وأقصر من المشدب, and he was shorter than someone who was too tall. عظيم الهامة. The hama is the vertex of the head. So now he's going to begin here at the top and go all the way to the bottom and describing him. The vertex is this point of the head, and he was azim. It had again, that we talked about the fullness of the or the notableness of the head of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rajil al-sha'r, again, his hair had a slight natural curl to it. In infaradat, this is what we were talking about earlier. Aqiqatuhu. The aqiqah is the natural kind of like hairline that allows your hair to part, right? If that naturally parted, right, farraqaha, then he would allow it to part. He would part it. If it parted a certain way, then he would let it keep going that way. But وَإِلَّا فَلَا يُجَاوِزُ شِعْرَهُ شَحْمَةَ الْأُذُنَيْهِ. Otherwise, he would just let it fall to the side, right? And it would never go past the earlobe. It would never go past this part here. So that's important because Rasulullah, he was someone who followed natural disposition. If his hair was naturally going one way, he would let it go. He would continue to follow that path and part it. Otherwise, he would just let it go. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وَإِذَا هُوَ وَفَرَهُ أَزْهَرُ اللَّوْنِ. Again, Ali is saying he had a wheatish, brownish complexion to his sin. وَاسِعُ الْجَبْنَيْنِ. He had a broad forehead. Now, we talked about how he had a broad chest. What does it mean to have a broad forehead? This forehead here, this is the place in the frontal lobe. This is where your aql resides. Your aql, right, is your intellect, but it's also more traditionally in the Arabic language, right? It's your ability to hold back, right? And the uqal in the Arabic language is the leash they would tie on the camel, right? And so this frontal lobe, right, is essentially like that part of, it's like if you call that your aqal, that is what's essentially like a restraint. And we could almost look at that as, talking about the intelligence of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the type of self-restraint that he had, or the karama that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave in terms of his dhihn or his aql. Azaj. Azajul hawajib sawabiq. Hawajib are your eyebrows. And azaj means like long, dense, and fine. So he had these long, dense, fine eyebrows that were sawabiq. They were complete, right? ولكن في غير قرن. But not to the point, right? Not to the point that his eyebrow would meet here in the middle. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he never let his eyebrows meet here in the middle to where it was almost like one eyebrow, right? Who's that guy who plays for Lakers? I'm forgetting his name right now. Feared the brow, right? Not like just blanking on his name. Can't remember. But not like that, right? So he had a space. He had a space in between. بينهما عرق يضره الغضب. He did have in between his eyebrows a vein. And anger, if he was ever angry, that vein would show. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, one thing to keep in mind, he would never get angry on his own accord. He would never get angry, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on behalf of his own interest or his own nafs. If his own interest or nafs were kind of like, wronged, he would always let that go. But if the right of Allah or the right of another human being was taken away, he would always get angry at that. And you could see that in his face. He would never lose his temper, right? But you could see the sign of discontent and anger on his face. Aqna al-'Abni, he had a slightly elongated nose. Lahu nurun ya'allu, but there was this look of light that would come on his nose, like this illumination of sorts. يحسبه من لم يتأمله الشم. If you didn't kind of like pay attention in detail, you would think that it was quite notable, right? But if you paid attention in detail, you would come to see, no, it's actually quite in proportion with the rest of his face. كث اللحية, he had a full beard, right? سهل الخدين, his two cheeks were smooth. ضليع الفهم, his mouth was also full. ضليع, ضلع is a rib. And if you notice, a rib has a natural convexity and concavity to it, right? And his face, his mouth, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, had this fullness, this full like concavity to it, where he had kind of like a broad mouth as well. And the scholars, they say that's indicative. Again, one of those things where the khalq is indicative of the khuluq, right? That's indicative of his fasaha, right? That broadness to his mouth is quite indicative of the fasaha that Allah created him with. وَتِيتُ جَوَامِعُ الْكَلَامِ, I've been given comprehensiveness in speech. Rasulullah was given fasaha, and he was given the greatest fasaha of all fasaha, which was the Quran. So he had to have the right tools to recite that and to teach it to people. And then it says that he was maflajul asnan, he had a slight gap in his teeth. And in another hadith it said that you could see light coming out of this slight gap in his teeth, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. دقيق المسربة مسربة, he had this fine line of hair that would go from his chest to his navel. كأن عنقه جيد دمية في صفاء الفضة, his neck was somewhat long. I'm sorry, his neck was it was fine and thin, and in the kind of like purest glare of like silver, right? So it had this kind of like white glare, if you will, that you might see with silver. Mu'tadul khalq, he was proportioned in his creation, badin, fully fleshed, meaning he never looked emancipated, right? He never looked like his body was weak, even though he would fast. Sometimes he would fast continuously. Sometimes he would only eat a couple pieces of bread and a couple of dates a day and just a little bit of water. Yet his body still looked fully fleshed, right? That's from the karama of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and from the barakah of everything that he ate, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Mutamasik, the parts of his body were held together. Even as he got older, it never looked like one part of his body started to lag or had a shaggy appearance to it, right? Sawa'ul batni wa sadri. This is really important. His chest and his belly were flush, one line, right? It didn't look like his chest protruded out too much. He wasn't like a bodybuilder, right? And it didn't look like his belly protruded out too much, right? So he wasn't like, obese, right? So his belly wasn't too big, but they were one line, right? They were exactly one line. It's also kind of significant because what's in the chest? The heart, which is the spiritual locus, right? And what's in the, what's in the kind of like the abdominal region? The stomach, which is kind of like a place of appetite. So he was proportioned and well balanced in those two things as well. His appetites, right? And his kind of spiritual, path. It was well proportioned. You can't just have one or the other. It has to be well proportioned. One coming out too far as opposed to the other is a sign that there's imbalance, right? In between those two things in your life. So, and Arid al-Sadr, we talked about he was broad-chested. Ba'idun bayn al-mankibayn, broad between the two shoulders. Dakhmul karadis, we talked about that. He had fullness in the endpoints of his bones. Anwarul mutajarrid, the parts of his body that were exposed had this like look of light. It had this like illuminating, the parts of his body that were exposed, it had this like illuminating appearance to it. موصول ما بين اللبة والسرة بشعر يجري كالخط, right? And again, that's talking about the hair that would run all the way down to his navel. عاري الثديين والبطن مما سوى ذلك. So he had that hair, but everything else in his stomach and in his chest region didn't have any hair on it. صلى الله عليه وسلم أشعر الذراعين والمنكبين وأعالي الصدر. But the highest part of his chest and his arms as well as his shoulders had a little bit of hair on it. طويل الزندين. His forearms were elongated. رحب الراحة, right? رحب الراحة. Raha is again the palm, and it's rahab. It was like spacious, right? And that's significant because Rasulullah ﷺ was always welcoming people to his community, but he was also so generous, right? And having that sense of like spaciousness in his palms, right? The amount of dua that he asked for, right, for his ummah, the welcomeness that he had for his ummah, the comfort that people had in coming to him, it's all kind of symbolic of that. We talked about the firmness and fleshiness as well in his palms and in the soles of his feet. The fingers and the toes had this slightly elongated appearance to them. The soles of his feet had a little bit of depth. And his feet were also smooth to the point that that water would flow off of them. Look at how well they're describing him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when he would get up to go somewhere, qala'an. We talked about like how his feet looked like it was stripping away the ground because he would go with purpose. يخطو تكفيا يمشي هونا. He would take a step as if he's going somewhere, and he would walk with calmness and collectiveness. وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا. The servants of the Rahman are the ones who walk in the earth with calmness. ضريع. He would take long steps. ضريع المشية إذا مشى كأنما ينحط من الصبب. We talked about when he walked, it was as if he was walking down a hill. وإذا التفت جميعا. And when he would turn towards someone, he would turn all together. خافض الطرف. He had a lowered gaze, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's really indicative of his modesty. نظره إلى الأرض أطول من نظره إلى السماء. He would look at the ground more often than he would look at the heavens. Sometimes when he was anticipating revelation, he would look up at the sky. But for the most part, he was in contemplation. And so his gaze was always on the ground. نظره جل النظر هو الملاحظة. Most of his looking was a looking of reflection, right? He would never stare at someone, right? He would never like look in desire or lust or something. His look was always, you know what that look looks like. It's a look of contemplation. And we're going to end with just one more hadith here in وَيُبَدِّرُ مَنْ لَقِيَ بِالسَّلَامِ. He would always greet someone with salam. The last hadith that I want to talk about is the hadith, or just two more here. رَأَيْتُ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. This is by Jabir ibn Samra. He says that I saw Rasulullah صلى الله عليه وسلم في ليلة إضحيان. In the night, I saw him in a night when it was a clear night, and it was a full moon from the beginning to the end. عليه حلة الحمراء. And he had this outfit with this red kind of hue to it. فَجَعَلْتُ أَنْظُرُ إِلَيْهِ وَإِلَى الْقَمَرِ. And I would look at him and I would look at the moon. And I would look at him and I would look at the moon. And I would look at him and I would look at the, فَلَوْ هُوَ عِنْدِي أَحْسَنُ مِنَ الْقَمَرِ. And I decided he looks more beautiful than the moon. And then Barra bin Azib one time, سأل رجل Barra bin Azib. Bara bin Azib was asked about the face of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Was his face like a sword, right? And Bara bin Azib says, قال لا بل مثل القمر. No, his face was like the moon. It had that round proportion. It had that glare to it. The moon is generally, in poetry of old, and even in Old English and in Old Arabic, the moon was always the standard of beauty, right? The Badr, right? The Badr, the Laylatul Badr, right, was like a beautiful woman, right? And so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his face was more beautiful than that. In other words, Allah gave beauty to his face beyond what the gold standard was for beauty in creation, right? Because the greatest beauty is actually beauty in character. And that was reflected in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in his actions. And that made his face even more beautiful. Your character, even if you have a beautiful physical complexion, if your character is not good, it will end up making you look bad. And even if your physical beauty is not like the moon, if your actual character is beautiful, it will make you as if you were greater than the moon. So sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was made beautiful because he was meant to be an appeal to people. The rest of the ahadith kind of have repetition to them a little bit. And so why don't we pause here at 7:09? The next week, we won't have an introduction, and a lot of the hadith are much shorter, and they're quicker to go through, so we can start getting through a lot more of the book. Even if we don't finish it in Ramadan, there's always options to finish it outside of Ramadan as well. But I do feel like descriptions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whether they're even in old scriptures of the Ahlul Kitab, or they're amongst our companions, this is a really important part of the knowledge of Seerah that we don't pay a lot of attention to, and something that inshallah we can get a better understanding. We'll start next week by talking about the seal of the prophethood, and then about the hair of the Prophet and his combing of his hair, so on and so forth. So we'll pause here.